I'd like to introduce Nick Tuosto, who's the Managing Director of Griffin Gaming Partners, and Russell Binder, partner at Stryker Entertainment. They'll be joined by Jordan Fragan, who will be moderating our fireside chat. They'll be discussing the art of the deal and understanding the modern marriage of Hollywood and games and what the future of entertainment will look like. Thank you.
Let's go, Russell.
Keep it going.
Hi, everyone. Thank you all for joining us today. Can you guys introduce yourselves quickly? I would love to get started with that. Yeah.
I'm Nick Tuosto. As mentioned, I co-founded Griffin Gaming Partners, which is now the largest investment vehicle focused on the video game sector with $1.2 billion in assets under management. I also lead the advisory business, M&A advisory, at LionTree for games companies.
And I'm Russell Binder. I'm the president of Stryker Entertainment. We're about a 17-year-old IP accelerator representing rights holders, producing film and television, and consulting for the entertainment and video game sector.
Excellent. So, we're here today at the Grammy Museum. We're here at the heart of pop culture in Los Angeles. I know we all understand that there is a massive opportunity for crossover between film and games and creating pop culture out of that. Can we maybe talk a little bit about the size of the opportunity, though, so we can really quantify just how big the opportunity is?
Sure, happy to start with some stats. Just to put things in context, the video game business, just in terms of consumer spend, is about $180 billion this year, and that's broken down between mobile, console, and PC, about half mobile, and then equal parts on PC and console. When you think about that in comparison to the global box office, it's more like a $26 billion market. But beyond that, it's not just the size that's different, it's also the type of franchises, the type of revenues. The video games business has really evolved into a live services business where a franchise like FIFA can expect billion-dollar plus revenues every single year. There's content to feed to an audience that's just voracious in terms of its appetite for that content. So the enterprise value associated with a new hit in games that is birthed is just night and day, orders of magnitude higher.
Excellent. So given that, why do you guys think that there's so much more crossover happening now compared to, even 5 years ago?
There's a lot of reasons. I think obviously community has been a big part of it. I think that everybody games. I think we can dictate that there's very few people in this room or in this community or in this world that don't have an iPhone or a console or a smart TV or some kind of access to gaming. And it doesn't have to be hardcore. It could be midcore. It could be soft. But there's this massive gaming community, and we come from a world of consumer products and toys and comic books and publishing, but video games have this unique opportunity to be propagated across the world much more quickly at the same time, almost simultaneously, where certain brands or IPs require time to develop over different communities and different territories. So the accessibility on a global basis happens a lot more quickly.
Excellent. Maybe on the macro factor side of things too, I think given the state of, the box office this past year, we're seeing what's working and what's no longer working. Video games obviously have such rich IP. Why do you guys think that studios are looking to mine new sources of IP?
Yeah, look, studios especially the big studios, have kind of lived on borrowing IP, whether it's from literary books, comic books, and now obviously video games have become a tremendous source of content for the studio system. And the studio system is made up of a bunch of different pieces, whether it's the big five families or it's smaller independent studios who can finance film and television. But at the end of the day, there's a lot of white noise out there. There's a lot of difficulty to consume. The audiences are spread so thinly, and it's hard to get attention. So if you can find an intellectual property that has a built-in community, a passionate fan base, and a level of awareness that you're not going to get from an original piece of content, which, by the way, we support as much original content as possible, it just helps break through the noise in a big way.
I also think, from a AAA perspective, there's just so much content, and in particular with open world type environments where a player might spend hundreds of hours in their favorite franchise. even in single player games, there's so much depth to the narrative content, the character development, and then the interaction being interactive just creates a different psychological resonance. So increasingly, if you think about 10 years ago, you could sort of look at the list of movies made from video game IPs, and Lara Croft Tomb Raider was probably the most successful of those examples. And today, it's like every year there's this steady drumbeat of Super Mario, of Gran Turismo, Last of Us, just constant activations of video game IPs that cross over. And I think, we can talk about some of that synergy, but it just dramatically increases your odds of success to take an IP that has that type of connective tissue and resonance with an audience and then do something, differentiated. You got to put the right creators behind it. And I can't wait to talk about the experience with Five Nights at Freddy's because I'm a huge fan.
I was wondering if you're going to mention that.
Yeah.
Maybe we should talk about it then. Obviously your journey with adapting an indie title that, had profound consequences on, the landscape of pop culture. I'd love to hear a little bit more about your journey doing that and, how the industry has evolved since you first started that journey.
Yeah, we started representing Scott Cawthon and Scott Games about 8 years ago. It was an independent PC title on Steam, and it just made its way to mobile. And we got a phone call from a t-shirt licensee that we'd like to do a lot of business with, and they said, hey, Five Nights at Freddy's, have you heard of it? I said, we have. They said, you should go after it. Everybody's asking for it. And everybody means like Hot Topic and Spencer's and a couple retailers. So we ended up reaching out to Scott and his team. Actually, it's really just Scott. It's an individual who controls this entire franchise, which is amazing in its own. Because I'm listening to Johanna and I'm like, Activision and Blizzard and this massive organization with resources that are next level and data. And I'm like, we have Scott, and we have like, it's a one-man band. It's pretty incredible. And he knew exactly what he wanted to do. And when we met him, he was in a Warner Brothers deal with, I think, Jeffrey Katzenberg's son and Roy Lee, and that deal was coming to expire. And I said, Scott, would you mind if we shopped it around town a little bit, because we've got these great relationships with certain producers and production companies in town, and we just started a relationship with Blumhouse. And I said, it feels like a natural home for an indie horror title to be at the best, biggest, most impressive horror brand in Hollywood. And Jason immediately got it. Scott connected really well with the enterprise, and 6 years later, we had a movie, and it honestly blew my mind. I knew we had a fan base, and I know we've built a $1 billion retail business around the consumer product side of it and the game side of it, but I had no idea the level of fandom and the deep level of fandom that existed, the way they came out for an $82 million opening weekend. It just was staggering. And not just that they come out, they were in costume and they were yelling at the screen, and it was like a party in every theater. It reminded me of like Rocky Horror Picture Show and Taylor Swift. Like, it was weird. But it was incredible to see. And then what the other beautiful part is, again, being an individual who has a small game company, our gaming business originally was like the US and like Russia. In Eastern Europe is where Five Nights was popular. And over the course of time, and with the movie and additional games, we started growing in international territories. We're a number 2 or 3 requested IP in LATAM, where our European business has grown dramatically. Our Asian business has grown dramatically. And a lot of part, that's just latching on different pieces of business over the last 6, 7 years to turn it into something that became global.
Absolutely. I think that there's a couple pieces to touch on there. Obviously working with Scott directly, that one-on-one relationship is so important, especially because, in recent adaptations, I think it's been much more common for the original creators to have more of a presence in the adaptation. I'd love to hear a little bit more about, what it was like to sort of negotiate and meet in the middle there, because I can imagine having control is such an important piece of any deal.
Yeah, there's a very talented lawyer in the room named Simon Pullman who will laugh me off the table. But Scott, there was no negotiation. Scott financed the movie. He wanted complete control. He knew exactly what he wanted. He just needed someone to shepherd him to get there. And Blumhouse is willing to take on that role. I'm not going to say the portion of his net worth that he invested to produce this movie, but originally it was started as a $5 to $7 million independent horror movie that turned into a $25 million film. When you saw the animatronics and everything that they built, it turned into a bigger film. But he wrote the script. He was on set every day. He helped select the director and Emma. He was, if I told you the amount of emails back and forth between Universal and Scott about every detail about the pizza boxes that are in the movie theaters, it's insane how much he gets done in a day. But he was really, it was in critical importance to him to be in control, because no one really knows that franchise better. And I think it paid off.
Sure. In that note, one of the things that made Five Nights at Freddy's so powerful, and we're seeing as sort of a amplification tool across the industry, is obviously the content creators that happen to make the game popular in the first place. I'd love to hear a little bit more about the impacts creators have had on your strategy when evaluating companies to sort of do deals with.
I love the fact that the word strategy. I've never been involved with a property as organically popular as Five Nights at Freddy's. And we've represented properties like the Twilight Saga and Hunger Games and The Walking Dead and Angry Birds. We've been in the business of billion-dollar franchises, but I've never seen anything happen like this, where it was the community that built it. It was the influencers and the creators who came to Scott, who became advocates of the IP, who, let's not forget Game Jolt, over 1 million fans on Game Jolt on Five Nights at Freddy's. They do the advocating and the shouting for us. I think we had the most difficult time especially on the consumer product side, because typically you're working 12 to 18 months out when you're developing products, and a video game would come out. We didn't even know it was coming out. Scott would just drop it. And it's like, how do you support, it's so atraditional, or untraditional rather, to do that. But we just kept chasing Scott's decision making. And again, he's definitely one of the smartest people in the room when it comes to knowing his brand and introducing that surprise, and the creators, the Markipliers, the Docos, the PewDiePies in the early days. Like, it was just, they were shouting, and they built a big part of their audience on supporting a Five Nights at Freddy's.
Nick, I'd love to get your take on just the impact that creators have had on the industry writ large. I think that when you're evaluating companies, whether it's to invest in them or to acquire them, or I think that there's a relationship that needs to be considered there. I'd love to hear a little bit more about your take on that, and sort of maybe the pros and cons of it.
When it comes to investment and acquisition both, I think you can look back at the history of successful companies that have built a lot of enterprise value, and most of those cases involve a creative team that remained in that kind of creative capacity going forward. After an acquisition, did the team stick, or did they end up going on to the next thing? And you see the lifeblood of these franchises that are live services, like I mentioned, is really the people. And it's a lot like the movie business in that regard. There's a lot of creative capacity for these teams that create these franchises in the first place, or even just know how to live operate a game. And so, when I think about the power of teams plus intellectual properties, it's a really important focus for us at Griffin in terms of investing, especially thinking about the next 10 years being very different than the last. If you think about just the Apple and Google app stores as examples, there are 1 million games in each. And most of those games are just dead, zombie games, but it's almost impossible to find an audience today. You have to have an incredibly high monetization rate, or get this sort of lightning in a bottle viral phenomenon like Pokemon Go had, for example. But when you have an intellectual property like a Pokemon or a Harry Potter, you end up seeing, or Marvel, is another great example with Marvel Snap, seeing 10 million plus downloads out of the gate. You solve this key pain point, which is reaching the users. You still have to build the great game on the other side. You got to create the live service, and the teams are really fundamental to that exercise. But with generative AI tools coming, you're going to see that noise in the marketplace probably increase by an order of magnitude. So over the next cycle of sort of predicting where the value will be created, absolutely critical are finding teams that have evidence of that kind of creative capacity, and then second, overweighting our exposure to intellectual property driven franchises.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting dynamic in the industry, just both, with IP being adapted into games and now games being adapted into IP, and how, there's value added on both sides. I'd love to hear a little bit more about, given that changing relationship where it used to be sort of more one direction, how has how's it been like, behind the scenes?
Yeah, it's interesting. In my early days of my career, it was really licensing. It was the entertainment business that was king, and they were licensing their content to game companies. And most of those games were terrible, but in the kids business in particular, it was a really good business. You could bring Pixar and those types of Disney IPs and Nickelodeon IPs to large console audiences, and it worked really, really well. Our first licensing deal we did was Gen 13 from Jim Lee's company, Image Comics, and then the next one was Hellboy, based on the Guillermo del Toro motion picture. And every licensing video game deal I've done over the years were terrible. And I think it wasn't just me, it was like virtually except Riddick, were really lowly rated, poor critically acclaimed games. And the pivot started coming when, I think, again, the studio system changed when you got into a lot of independent filmmaking, and independent filmmakers took the destiny in their own hands. They were producing lower budget films, and little independent studios started popping up, and it got you out of the big five family system. Gaming was the same way. It was the big publishers, and then over the course of time, independent developers started really rising up, and their storytelling and their art and their creativity and their passion really began growing. And that's how companies like mine really were able to get into the adaptation business, because I wasn't repping EA. I wasn't getting Activision IP. I was looking for the smaller fish who had incredibly cool content that we felt could bubble up, could lend itself to, consumer products and products that serve that fandom, but that also have that translatability into film and television. And again, there's just I love the analogy. Like, I think when Men in Black was made, if I'm not mistaken, it was like 2,500 comic books that were sold that turned into a movie that was massively, global. Even a small independent video game can get 1 million, 1.5 million, 2 million units sold, and then you've got the TikTok side of it and the social media side further broadening the awareness of that IP, and that makes it really attractive for filmmakers. And also, I think filmmakers today, especially the younger ones, under 30 or under 35, they all grew up on video games, so it's not a difficult conversation. They're not trying to figure out how to adapt a game. They're gamers themselves, and it makes it a lot more interesting and easy, I think.
Sure, and maybe this is a good point to sort of actually circle back a little bit and think about what makes a good adaptation in the first place. I think that there's a lot of films and games and that have been adapted well, and some that have been adapted poorly. I'd love to hear a little bit more about what you guys look for, or at least what you would look for in terms of a game, if it comes into your awareness. Like, what is it? The lore? Is it the premise? Is it the emotions? I'd love to hear a little bit more about.
Yeah, I was on a call yesterday with a studio. We were looking at a new video game IP to adapt, and I think the feature development executive said it perfectly. So we're looking for the feeling. We're looking for the ability to, you might not have the best story in your game, or I love the analogy also of Lego, the Lego movie. It's a plastic brick, and you're able to turn that into a massive film and television franchise. And that's because it's imagination and creativity that drive that Lego business. And on the video game side, it's really that feeling. It's the lore. It's storytelling. It doesn't matter how cool your characters look. It doesn't matter how amazing the universe is or the world that has been built. If you don't have interesting characters and a really compelling story to tell, it's not going to translate well. Now, if you've got that, then you can build around it. Then it becomes something pretty special.
I also think that the bar is in some respects different. When you have like a video game IP like Mortal Kombat, for example, you can make a movie and the critics, if you just look at Rotten Tomatoes, didn't love the film, but the audiences did. And in part that's because the audience is showing up with this degree of excitement, this pent up enthusiasm for the intellectual property. And as long as it feels like it stays true to the video game lore, it's a different sort of, I would say it's a different bar, in terms of what defines success. And for Warner Brothers Discovery to see, the amount of engagement, the amount of, new subscriptions on HBO Max, that's success for them. And it creates more enduring, intellectual property value so that the next video game series probably has an even bigger audience and you can continue to grow what is the core of your business. I think Warner Brothers will be one to watch closely because in contrast to the other big media companies, they really wanted to own the capability of building games, creating this cross-platform activation of the intellectual properties. And Harry Potter Hogwarts Legacy is bigger than the films. I mean, you look at the aggregate level of revenue, let alone engagement, which is multiples of the engagement you get in terms of 2 hours per movie per person. I mean, people are spending, in some cases, hundreds of hours exploring this open world, getting deeper into that intellectual property universe. That builds IP value, unlike, a standalone strategy where you just make movies and license your IP to the highest bidder.
And even speaking, I spoke earlier this week to Netflix about a particular IP, and it was interesting, their perspective on transmedia and bringing more gaming IP into their film and television fold was, they weren't really interested in the smaller independent IPs. They were like, if it's not AAA, if it's not God of War, if it's not a big IP, that's not where they're looking right now. So it's interesting that they're starting to understand, or not just, I should say understand, but lean towards only the biggest of the IP. And I thought it was also interesting yesterday, there was an article, the CEO of Take-Two was talking about the potential damage you can do to your brand. And that's why you haven't seen Grand Theft Auto adapted. That's why I think there was another title in their portfolio they've yet to adapt. And yet Fallout will probably break records on Amazon is my expectation. It looks amazing. But that's, Jonah Nolan, and that's an incredible team of creators and storytellers. They put the right emphasis on that property. But, there's a very high risk. My biggest nervousness came, my biggest piece of anxiety came on Five Nights, which is we've got this incredible program. It's kicking butt. Fans are really into the brand. If this movie stinks, what does it do to the IP? The critics hated it. The critics panned the movie, but the fans went like crazy, and that's really what helped us propel that IP. So yeah, it's interesting times.
Absolutely. I feel like it's interesting that the audience has so much say now. It's sort of, obviously voting with your wallet is such a, useful tool to measure, at least the impact a game can have and what's resonating with people. In terms of that relationship with the audience, how much do you use data to help you identify potential, IP or games that you might be interested in involving yourself with more?
Very little. I mean, for us, we're a smaller company. We're an 8-person organization, and we hunt for really interesting content. We search, we look under rocks, we go on YouTube, we go on Twitch, we listen, and we also just think we have taste. It's subjective, but I think we've got really good taste. We've made some really good selections over the years. And if you think about it, I think one of the topics here was, how do you know when these can become a franchise? Or how do game developers, are they developing a game or are they developing a franchise? And I think you always start with, develop a great game. Because if the game is there and the fans start, enjoying the experience, the rest will come into place. And that's our specialty, is bringing on those different pieces. We're not Disney. We don't have a theme park division. We don't have a video game division. We don't have a film. We have to bring partners and patchwork a franchise build plan together. But our strength is listening. We also get a lot of phone calls from retailers, everyone from Walmart up to GameStop, saying, hey, this is bubbling up. You guys should be going after this because the fans are coming in and they're asking for these products. So I wish we had more data gathering capabilities, but we're not that sophisticated.
And I think maybe one last thing to touch on, obviously it's great. We can talk about the domestic market as much as we want, but we all know that the global market is so important nowadays. What has it been like? Because I think obviously there are certain types of games that are more popular in different markets, and what has it been like to sort of try to find something where you have to take, a more universally appealing take on a franchise in order to have it reach an international market?
Yeah, it's a really good question. there are certain projects we've worked on over the years that have had tremendous success in Western territories, but were forgotten about in the Asian territories. We had a property years ago, you guys might remember the Ted movie from Seth MacFarlane. Like, it did really well here, but Japan went crazy, and you couldn't have predicted how crazy Japan went for this foul-mouthed comedic bear. But it was insane. So it's, you think global, but there are going to be territorial preferences and biases to certain types of gameplay, to certain types of experiences. And indie gamers, indie game developers don't always have the marketing muscle to really push their games into these other territories. So that's where, again, the social platforms have a big role. But I think you focus, again, on what's a universal story and what are universal characters, and then build from there. And if it resonates, it resonates.
Nick, maybe I think it would be important to talk about, when you're evaluating either a new game to invest in or, evaluating an acquisition target, talking about that international appeal. I mean, how much does that factor into your decision making?
I mean, it factors in massively. I mean, gaming is just an incredibly global market. When you think about the important markets, the U.S. is very important, but, it pales in comparison to a game that can activate in, China, which is, equally large, in Japan, in Korea, all the rest of the smaller markets aggregated. You also have this sort of talent heat map where these individual geographies, like Israel is a big one, Turkey is a huge one, Helsinki, another where Rovio started. Yeah, Poland. You get these sort of clusters of development talent, and we spend a lot of time making sure we have the kind of feet on the ground relationships, understanding the talent, map, in order to be able to deploy capital. But in contrast to, Russell's sort of gut instinct, like if I heard a pitch about, an animatronic bird with a cupcake that bites people's faces, I'd be like, I don't know. I mean, maybe.
Billion-dollar franchise.
We look at the data. And so we're tracking constantly, what are the monetization rates, engagement rates, and we're looking at comps effectively, looking at, similar games that have succeeded, and how do we think this maps to that. So our business is much more, I think, science-driven, but it's awfully hard to kind of pick those creators and those unforeseen things like Five Nights, without that sort of gut instinct that Russell has.
Yeah, but on the flip side, when we were representing Candy Crush, you're talking about one of the largest mobile games of all time, and we adapted that into a TV show on CBS, way too many years ago, and it was a failure. Like, we started with a few million viewers, and then a couple million viewers, and then a million viewers, and it didn't translate. It might have been on everybody's phone, but what we learned was people want to play Candy Crush. They don't want to watch other people play Candy Crush. The characters from Candy Crush also were really youthful looking, but the game serviced 30 to 50-year-old women. So there's a big disconnect in the visuals and the characters against the opportunity and the audience. So yeah, it doesn't always work.
Excellent. We're good? Okay. It was great to have you guys here, and thank you both for joining me. We'll have the next session on in a moment.
Thanks
Thank you.
everybody.